Well, I want to welcome you to the webinar. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. I'm Cody Horton, Managing Director of Diverse Recruiting Experts. And today we've got with us Dr. Dena Samuels, who is an accomplished author, coach, consultant, and an expert in mindfulness, diversity, and inclusion topics. And I want to kick it over to Dena and just let her talk a little bit about her background.
Sure, thank you. Thanks very much, Cody. I am so honored to co-host and have this conversation with you here today. So thank you for the invitation, first and foremost. So I taught at the university in social justice studies, specifically in women's and ethnic studies, for about 20 years. And I was consulting on the side, and about 2 years ago, I left my my tenured position to actually consult full time. And so that's what I do now. And I consult with companies, organizations, campuses across the country. And pre-COVID, I was, going here, there, and everywhere. But now it's more like this, right, online. So I've been doing a lot of that, and just incorporating this notion of mindfulness, that it turns out that if you have a mindful practice of any kind, it actually lowers your bias. And so I've started to bring that in as a tool, and that's sort of the subject of my latest book called The Mindfulness Effect. So as I said, really happy to be here, excited to have this particular conversation, because this is the one that so many people have been asking about recently. How, what do we do and how do we do it? And what do we need to be doing? So.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I know you've worked with some of the biggest organizations, both government and corporate out there. So I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to join us. And I know the audience will be very appreciative of the insight that you're going to share. And so today we're going to talk about a number of things. We're going to cover some of the things that people have been just wondering about. Why are we focused on race? We're going to cover some definitions so we level set the conversation. And then we're going to look at what's a leader's role in addressing racism, and how do you keep your leaders moving forward? And then what are some steps that people can take to really make an impact, make a difference and have an impact. And so one of the things, Dena, I'd love to have you be able to kind of talk about is some of the definitions, because we hear all these different terms like bias and prejudice and bigotry and discrimination and racism. Can you talk a little bit about those so that people have a better understanding of how you differentiate those, and maybe some of them are the same?
Sure. So there's a lot of, those are a lot of words that a lot of people use interchangeably, and some of them I would say are more similar than others. I'm going to talk a little bit later more about bias, but just to start off, I think that's a good, it's a good starting place just to give a basic definition, which is the idea that, there's conscious bias and there's unconscious bias. And that's the idea that, what's happening, the unconscious part. If you're consciously biased, it's like, that you have a preference for one thing over another, right? And we can talk later about exactly how that happens, how that manifests in our brains. Because if you have a brain, you're biased. We all have those kinds of preferences. So this is not about blaming or shaming either. And I want to start off with that notion as well, that people don't need to feel like they are, being beaten over the head, or, that sounds like a violent way to say that, but that people feel like they're really being hit with something that that they're nervous about talking about, when the reality is we all have those biases. And so it's something that we've learned, that's ingrained in our brain. Again, I can come back to that later. The word prejudice is similar in the sense that we may, prejudice and bias are similar. Prejudice is very much like you have a certain feeling, you have a certain attitude about a specific group. And this is what comes up in your brain as you think about, as you see somebody from that group, there's some prejudice that might come up. And you'll see how these words become differentiated as we go. The word bigotry has actually a lot more weight to it. So when you think about bigotry, it's actually you're now not only holding it in your brain, but you actually could be behaving in a bigoted way, right? That's where and then we get to discrimination, which is all about action. So bigotry and discrimination, those sort of go hand in hand as well. And I come from a sociological viewpoint. I'm a sociologist by training. And so my definition, for example, of racism might be different than perhaps a psychologist's view. Social psychology might look at it differently than I do, but I'm going to share from my own perspective, which is that when you bring in racism, now you're talking about discrimination plus power.
Okay.